Hi everybody, welcome to Human Geography. Welcome to Chapter 7, Political Geography. I'm going to warn you right off the bat that, wow, do we pack a lot into this chapter. But again, this is supposed to be an overview of human geography, and if this is something you're more interested in, I urge you to learn more about political geography, but it's going to be quick. So our opening slide here, this is a mural in Leon, Nicaragua. You can see on the left, Sandinista rebels are shown symbolically crushing the formerly U.S.-supported dictator of Nicaragua, Anastasio Somoza, and on the right, they are stepping on Uncle Sam himself. So, key concepts in political geography. I think the concept that is the least intuitive is the development of the state and its sovereignty. Basically, the idea of the state, what it is, and how that plays into political geography as a whole. So first of all, what is political geography? Well, in short, it's the spatial aspect of political affairs. So we're looking at politics, but how it relates to space. Territoriality is this idea of strong attachment to a place or an area. And geographers don't necessarily see this attachment as innate, but rather as a factor of lots of different social and cultural factors that are related to this larger question of identity. I mean, let's back up a second and think, have you ever looked at a world map and wondered why it looks the way it does? Why is a country a country? There's nothing necessarily natural about the boundaries of a country. It's much too big of a question to answer in a single sort of sentence or summary, but it has a lot to do with the development of the state. In short, sort of territory is used as the basis for political organization, and this is rooted in the idea of sovereignty, or the authority of a state over its own affairs, and that it should have freedom from control from outside forces. So this here, this illustration is a map of the Republic of Cyprus. The Republic of Cyprus got its independence in 1960. On the right is the ethnic distribution in 1870. You can see that there's a rift between the Greek and the Turkish Cypriots. There was a coup in 1974. Turkey invaded the northern half of the island, and the UN established a buffer zone between the two. Thousands of people were displaced, and the Turkish Republic of North Cyprus was established, but it was only recognized by Turkey. Nicosia, the capital city, was also divided. In 2008, Nicosia was reopened to sort of symbolize the reunification. But you can see how these ideas of boundaries and states and countries are flexible and change according to different sort of historical and political events. So, like I mentioned earlier, this idea of nations versus states. First of all, sorry, I'm just getting over a cold. First of all, a nation is a group of people who have a collective identity that are rooted in a common history, heritage, and attachment to a specific territory. A nation is not necessarily a state, however. It refers to the people, whereas the state refers to the political unity. So nationalism is pride in a nation, and patriotism is pride in a state. So does that make sense? A state is the boundaries that are drawn on paper, whereas the nation is the group of people who have the identity that's sort of rooted in a place and sort of various common social, historical, and political factors that unite them. So a multinational state is when a population consists of two or more nations. This includes places like Brazil, China, and Canada. A national state is when the boundaries of a nation coincide with the boundaries of a state. So this means there's generally sort of a homogeneous population within that state. The U.S. is a little bit complicated. It can be understood as both, but in general the U.S. is multinational because it includes Native American nations, but it functions as a nation state due to the political identity of the U.S. that sees the U.S. as sort of one indivisible unit. So, imperialism and colonialism. This contributed greatly to multinational states because it has brought different groups into contact. So first of all, imperialism is one state's exercise of direct or indirect control over affairs of another in political society. Colonialism was a type of imperialism where a state takes control over a foreign territory and occupies and governs it. And strategies, it's basically a strategy of a state to extend their power and control globally. In Africa and in the Americas, they were under colonial power until 1914. And Africa is basically one of the largest land grabs in world history. This idea of self-determination is the ability to choose one's own political status, and post-World War II it was given to Africa and other colonized people, even though the legacy of colonialism continues to affect Africa to this day. So you can see here, you can see the international boundaries between states, and you can see the tribal boundaries, and you can see that they really, really don't match up. You can see that the international boundaries have a lot more to do with ease of settlement by colonial powers than actual tribal boundaries, and this is part of what's contributed to ethnic conflict within Africa. So the present day boundaries represent, like I just said, the colonial boundaries better than tribal boundaries. For instance, in Rwanda, the Hutu and the Tutsi animosities were stoked by European colonial powers, and their conflict has continued through the present. In the 1990s, the state descended into a civil war, and there was a new constitution developed in 2003, ensuring a balance of power, but there are still many refugees. Okay, the geographical characteristics of states. Well, first of all, boundaries. What is a boundary? Well, it's good to think of a boundary actually as a vertical plane that's represented as a line on a map. A lot of the time we think of them as horizontal, but if you can sort of imagine it as vertical, as going from the ground all the way high up into the atmosphere, that's a much better sort of spatial representation of a boundary. So boundaries in coastal states extend offshore. They're called territorial seas. And historically, territorial seas didn't extend further than 12 miles offshore, but the EEZ, or an exclusive economic zone, can extend to up to 200 miles offshore. And basically, this is a way for states to gain control of coastal resources. So boundaries, of course, are political, but they often make use of physical features like rivers or mountains, which are called physiographic boundaries. Geometric boundaries are straight. They often follow lines of latitude or longitude. Ethnographic boundaries are based on cultural traits like religion, language, or ethnicity. And a relic boundary is a former boundary that is no longer enforced. A great example of this, shown in the image here, is the Great Wall of China. So, Hispaniola. This is a little sort of example of boundaries, the making of the boundary in Hispaniola. So Hispaniola is occupied by two states. The west is Haiti, and the east is the Dominican Republic. Both states got independence. Haiti got it in 1804, the Dominican Republic got it in 1844, but they disputed the location of this boundary. So basically, if you look at this stamp, you can see that the Dominican Republic boundary, they released the stamp, they perceived the boundary very differently than on the map in the upper right. Basically, the release of this stamp caused huge political upheaval. Can you see, if you look at this image, you can actually see the ethnographic boundary on the map. On this side, there's much lower vegetation. In Haiti, due to a higher population density and more political upheaval. So you can see that something as simple as the release of a stamp showing a different boundary can really sort of create a lot of political conflict. So a territorial extent and configuration. So an enclave is a territory that's completely surrounded by another state but not controlled by it. Whereas an exclave is a territory separate from the state to which it belongs. So Vatican City, it's completely surrounded by Italy, and Lesotho is an enclave state in that it's completely surrounded by South Africa. States are subdivided into regions and territories, and how the state interacts with the subdivisions varies from country to country. Basically, there's two main systems. There's the federal system, which is that some territorial authority is given to subdivisions to develop their own laws and policies, whereas the unitary system is this idea of power being condensed in the central government instead of being subdivided. So centripetal and centrifugal forces. So basically what these are forces that affect the unity of a state, either by bringing them together or by pushing them apart. So centripetal is a circumstance that binds the social and political fabric of a state, and centrifugal is one that weakens the internal unity of a state. So we're going to look a little bit at Kosovo. So Kosovo has a Serbian minority and an Albanian majority, and declared independence from Serbia in 2008. This was both a centrifugal and a centripetal force. Centrifugal and centripetal? Saying these too many times. Because they threaten the unity of the Serbian state. We were talking about centripetal and centrifugal forces. So again, when Kosovo declared its independence from Serbia in 2008, it was both a centrifugal and centripetal force because it threatened the unity of the Serbian state. But at the same time, it renewed Serbian attachment to the region. So you can see in these images on the left, the sign says that Kosovo is Serbia, which is basically opposing Kosovo's declaration of independence. But then here on the right, a Kosovar Albanian is showing off the new Kosovo flag. So political decisions can be both centripetal and centrifugal simultaneously. So this term here at the bottom, the raison d'etre, this is a French word, and basically it means that the belief that there is some sort of purpose for a state. And it's really the core of centrifugal forces. So you can think about the United States. What does the United States mean? What holds it together? What's the purpose of it existing? I'm sure a few terms sort of come to mind. What that is the raison d'etre. It definitely keeps the centrifugal forces strong. So separatism and devolution. So the stability of a state depends on how well it balances centrifugal and centripetal forces. Separatism is the desire of a nation to break apart from a state, and it happens when a nation's sense of identity is challenged and it perceives that it's different. Devolution is when a state transfers power to a self-identified community within it. So basically it's a means of accommodating separatist pressures without necessarily dissolving the state itself. So you can see the illustration used here is a Basque country. So from the 1930s to 1975, Spain was ruled by the dictator Francisco Franco, and he basically had a very strong belief in this idea of the nation state. He banned a couple of native languages, forbade national symbols, but it was centripetal for certain groups within the country. It led to the formation of the ETA, a Basque terrorist group. In 1978, Spain ratified a new constitution that recognized the unity of Spain, but gave autonomy to various regions within it. So basically now there are 17 different autonomous regions. Basque and Catalonia regions manage their own police forces, education system, and health care. Catalonia, the region of Catalonia, is now very wealthy, and it basically uses its economic success as a bargaining chip to be able to gain additional autonomy from Spain as a whole. So internationalism and supranational organizations. I can't talk today. Getting over a cold, and apparently it's getting to my brain. So internationalism is basically the development of close political and economic relations between states, and it can counter destabilizing forces like separatism. Supranational organization is basically when multiple states agree to work together for a common purpose. So this can be economic or military or cultural, and it tends to be generally multiple factors, multiple purposes occurring simultaneously. So the United Nations, or the UN, is a supranational organization that supports peace and security. It was founded in 1945, and it builds cooperative relations between states and uses diplomacy to negotiate peaceful solutions between them. Basically, it was created as an attempt to avoid World War III after the devastation of the first two world wars, and it includes almost every country in the world with the exception of the Vatican City and Kosovo, since Kosovo's status as a state is still disputed. It consists of different parts who are in charge of different things. There's the WHO, the World Health Organization, there's the FAO, the Food and Agricultural Organization, but the real power is really in the Security Council. Basically what they do is they recommend sanctions or peacekeeping. So basically, the Security Council needs 9 votes from non-permanent members and unanimous agreement by permanent members to be able to move forward with sanctions or peacekeeping efforts. So for instance, there wasn't sufficient UN support to overthrow Saddam Hussein in 2003 because China, France, and Russia opposed it. So the EU is another supranational, I cannot do that one today, a supranational organization to enhance economic cooperation in Western Europe. There were a variety of events that brought it into being, but there were 2 big ones. One is the 1957 Treaty of Rome. Basically, it committed the signatories to having greater economic unions through the creation of a single common market. And also the Treaty of Brussels in 1967, which provided a framework for political cooperation, which included the European Parliament. The Treaty of Brussels also renamed the organization the EEC, the European Economic Community, the European Community, rather than just being economically based. And the Treaty of Rome incorporated the idea that the EEC would basically attract other countries by sharing the same sort of political and economic ideals. And basically the Eurozone is the 16 countries that have replaced their currency with the euro to date. So you can see here, so the EU expanded from 12 countries in 1992 to 27 countries at present. There was major progress in 1999 when the EU adopted a single currency, the euro. 16 countries now use the euro, which formed the Eurozone. But one thing to think about is why some countries might not use the euro, who are part of the EU, and why might countries not in the EU use the euro. So there's a couple big exceptions here. Turkey has yet to be included. You can see over here. Turkey has yet to be included due to its high population and high debt and some problems with inflation. It's seen as sort of too much of a liability. There's also some issues with its stance on Cyprus and with human rights issues. This is a very divisive issue within the EU, and it's worth thinking about what some pros and cons of allowing Turkey to join the EU might possibly be. Global politics. So geopolitics. Basically, geopolitics are the study of relations amongst geography, states, and global powers. Most traditionally, it's how states acquire powers, the relations amongst states, and the formulation of foreign policy. But there are multiple different schools of thought as to how states and the power relations between those states develop. So Frederick Retzel, he was German, he was alive from 1884 to 1904, and he basically created the theory of the organic state in 1897, which basically compared the growth of the state to an organism, like a biological organism. So he basically argued that states need sustenance, basically resources and room to grow. He called this Lebensraum, or living space, and basically that there was a strong connection between the natural environment and the power of the state. So basically adding new territories would increase the strength of a certain state. This is influenced strongly by environmental determinism, and it's pretty problematic now. It basically shows sort of the influence of Darwin on the thinking of the time, basically arguing that states sort of compete for space like animals. Retzel never used the theory to influence politics, but it was adopted by some neo-Nazi groups who also coined the term geopolitics, and it was used by Germany to justify the expansion of the German state. So German geopolitics have since been sort of tainted with these Nazi connections. So Mackinder, a very famous geographer, he basically created this idea of the heartland theory. He believed that geopolitical stability was based on a balance of power between states. So if a balance of power was upset, a single state could become the dominant world power, which he believed would happen through the control of the large Eurasian landmass because it was free from being attacked by the ocean. He called this the geographical pivot, or the heartland. Again, this is also sort of problematic in that it's highly influenced by environmental determinism, basically seeing territory as critical to power, though he did recognize that there were other factors that went into power, such as transportation networks and the economic strength of a state. But like the theory of the organic state, it sort of oversimplifies the dynamics of geopolitics and what creates power. So the Cold War, this basically describes the hostility and the rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union that occurred between the mid-1940s and the 1980s. It was basically the countries were engaged in a nuclear weapons race. This created a bipolar world that was divided into two sort of opposing groups. And it was strongly influenced by the idea that if one country became communist, other countries would follow, called the domino theory. This justified the U.S. tactic of containment to limit the spread of hostile power or an ideology. And basically, the U.S. became involved in Vietnam to contain the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, with the idea that if Vietnam became communist, Southeast Asia would inevitably become communist because of the domino theory. Let me grab some water here. So contemporary and critical geopolitics. So the end of the Cold War basically meant the end of bipolar global relations. Many geographers believe that still there's a bipolar configuration of the world between the global north and the global south, which we'll talk a little bit later when we talk about the geography of development, that's separated by the level of development and wealth. Like I say, we'll talk more about this in Chapter 9. But there are two other schools of thought about contemporary geopolitics. The first one is this idea of multipolar. So this is developed by Samuel Huntington, who wrote a book called The Clash of the Civilizations and the Making of the World Order. It was published in 1996. Basically, he argued that instead of there being sort of two opposing groups, rather there were multiple civilizations, or the world was multipolar. He argued that civilization is the largest scale by which meaningful personal identity is derived, and that religion is the most important part of the development of this idea of civilization. Basically, he argued that future conflict would be on the basis of cultural conflicts along fault lines where different civilizations meet, so not necessarily where states met, but rather where these civilizations met. And this could occur either along borders or within individual states themselves. So this still sort of privileges this idea of there being strong bonds between people and territory. The second view is deterritorialization, or basically the idea that globalization facilitates a sort of fundamental loosening between people and places, and that facilitates deterritorialization, or sort of a loss of attachment between people and places. So members of a nation may be geographically dispersed across the world, but maintains ties or virtual communities due to global networks. So they don't necessarily need a territory to be able to maintain their community identity. So globalization and terrorism. So what is terrorism? Terrorism is basically the use of violence against civilians, typically by groups that don't have a lot of power or agency within a state, to inculcate fear, gain influence, and potentially advance one sort of specific cause. Terrorism is nothing new. It's been used as a political tactic by individuals and groups and states for a very, very long time. It's mostly conducted by individuals and small groups, but sometimes can be state-sponsored. According to the U.S. State Department, there are 4 state sponsors of terrorism. These include Cuba, Iran, Sudan, and Syria. So there are 4 categories of terrorism. There are revolutionary, which is basically this idea of advocating for regime change. Separatist, basically groups that are seeking sort of autonomy or independence from a state. There are single-issue groups, so this might be maybe particularly radical animal rights groups, and then there's religious. So Al-Qaeda is influenced by revolutionary and religious motives. So in 1988, when Al-Qaeda was founded it was founded against the Soviet Union because the Soviet Union had troops who invaded Afghanistan and occupied the capital city. So later, sort of this revolutionary goal was infused with a religious motivation, this idea of waging holy war against invaders. So the goal of Al-Qaeda is to establish a pan-Islamic caliphate, or basically this idea of there being a Muslim-controlled state that encompasses a very, very large Islamic community that stretches from Spain to Indonesia. So also is the idea that they want to force sort of Westerners to leave Islamic countries. Obviously, the 9/11 attack is one of the most famous. There was also the failed 2009 Christmas Day attack on the Northwestern Airlines flight from Amsterdam to Detroit. So members of Al-Qaeda come from countries around the world and has a global representation. It's both decentralized and geographically diffused. And they carefully manage sort of communications so that the different cells don't know about the work of other cells. So some consider this decentralization a product of globalization. So basically the idea that the advancement in internet and communication technology makes it fast, easy, and cheap for Al-Qaeda to share information. Other terrorist experts believe that terrorism represents a resistance to globalization and a diffusion of Western values. So basically a rise in terrorism in Iraq and Afghanistan post-U.S. involvement. So you can see this graphic here. This is terrorism by region. You can see this sort of spike in Western Europe here in the 1970s caused by the status of Northern Ireland and Basque Country and the French island of Corsica. And you see it's gone down sort of pretty fundamentally since then. Here's a graphic that shows terrorism in Afghanistan and Iraq. So the Taliban has been responsible for the bulk of attacks in Afghanistan, while Al-Qaeda and their affiliates are responsible for the bulk of attacks in Iraq. What they do is target government facilities and personnel, also coalition and foreign workers in both places. Electoral geography. Told you this chapter included a lot. So let's talk a little bit about electoral geography, because it definitely is something that geographers study within the realm of political geography. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about the electoral system. So what the electoral system is basically a set of procedures that are used to convert the votes that are cast in a region to seats won by a single party or a candidate. And electoral geography, therefore, is the study of the spatial aspects of electoral systems, voting districts, and election results. So there are two main global electoral systems. The first is a majority plurality representation. So basically this is the idea that the person who received the majority of the votes is elected and represents all voters in a district. Pretty straightforward, right? It's commonly associated with regions with two parties like the United States. Whereas the other approach is proportional representation or party political representation. So basically multiple representatives are elected and voters choose from among parties rather than amongst candidates, and the seats are divided on a proportional basis. This is widely used in Europe. So every state is divided into congressional districts, which are represented by a single congressperson. So this idea of reapportionment makes sure that each representative speaks for an equal number of people. So redistricting is basically the process of changing congressional districts if the population or demographics of a state change, basically to redraw the boundaries of these different congressional districts. So we're looking here at Arizona. Between 1990 and 2000, the population of Arizona increased by 40% and basically gained 2 House seats through reapportionment, and then became spatially very uneven, so they had to redistrict. On the right, you see pie charts showing how different the ethnic makeup is of each region, and you can imagine that that ethnic makeup may have something to do with how those different regions vote. So reapportionment and redistricting are supposed to increase fairness and access to political representation, but many groups are aware of the ways in which redistricting can affect the outcome of an election. So what gerrymandering is the process of changing the boundaries of electoral districts to favor certain groups. So you can see here we have 3 maps of Texas. What's highlighted in green is the 23rd Congressional District. You can see it right here. And this first map shown in 2002. The district was 55% Hispanic, 41% Caucasian, and 4% other ethnicities. In the second image here in 2004, you can see how the boundaries were changed. They were changed in 2003 to eliminate a very large area here right around Laredo, which excluded basically 100,000 Hispanics from the district and making the district much more likely to elect a Republican. In 2006, the Supreme Court upheld the redistricting, but found that it was in fact gerrymandered to exclude the Hispanic vote. So what it did was it ordered further redistricting, which, ironically enough, reduced the area around Laredo even more. Political landscapes. So political landscapes, or landscapes of central authority, are political landscapes that are the result of policies that are implemented by a central or a federal government. So they contribute to the process of state building. They connect parts of a country together while reinforcing the central government and the authoritativeness of the central government. A security landscape is a specific type of landscape that protects the territory, the people, and the infrastructure of a particular state. Security cameras, metal detectors, gated entrances protect people living in a state and deter terrorist attacks. Landscapes of governance. In landscapes of governments, basically laws deter or encourage certain behaviors. So for instance, farm policies engender certain types of agricultural processes and practices. And the government can pass laws that make it appealing to certain businesses to establish themselves in an area. So for instance, national parks are laws that protect the ecological significance of an area. So basically, it's important to look when you're looking out at a particular landscape, the ways in which the governance of the area have influenced what that landscape looks like. So political iconography, what political iconography is an image, an object, or a statute that conveys a certain political message. Here in 2003, Marines placed an American flag on the face of a statue of Saddam Hussein in Baghdad. And you can think how this image might be interpreted very differently by Americans and Middle Easterners. And if you want to take a little bit of time to look at more political iconography, you can look at this web link, which looks at political wall murals in Northern Ireland.